the lack of understanding and the lack of acceptance, the lack of protection, the lack of embrace of trans and non-binary young people in our lives means that they are encountering a lack of safety, physical harm, and damage on an everyday, every week, every month basis.
Welcome to Talking About Kids. I'm your host, R. Bradley Snyder, researcher, activist, and co-author of the What Every Child Needs to Know series of board books for pre-readers. In honor of Pride Month, I wanted to look at sexual orientation and gender identity and expression in kids. In particular, I wanted a better understanding of the terms that are used to describe gender identity and gender expression. I also wanted to get an overview of exactly what happens when we fail to support kids who are perceived as not conforming to the prevailing sexual and gender norms. To help with this, I reached out to Madelaine Adelman. Maddie is a professor of justice studies in the School of Social Transformation at Arizona State University. She's an author, and for over 2 decades, she's been one of the driving forces in GLSEN, which is a national organization that was founded by teachers to promote safe, supportive, and LGBTQ inclusive K through 12 education. This podcast was sponsored in part by the Arizona Department of Health Services Must Stop Bullying campaign through its Title V Maternal and Child Health Program. For more information, go to muststopbullying.org. And now, the interview.
I'm cisgender. My gender identity is the same or aligned with that which was assigned at birth. So I was assigned female at birth, and I use she, her pronouns. And I identify as a woman and a female. And as a young girl, I felt constrained by society's expectations about what a young girl could do or should do or could sound like or look like. And um, so I've always been interested in the kind of boxes that society provides to us, how rigid they are, how permeable they are. Gender's one of them. And
Right.
certainly as an educator, I'm interested in meeting my students where they're at and getting them what they need. So the continuity with my own experience and the young people that I encounter today is both similar and different. So I'm really interested
Mm.
in how young people are experiencing gender today in 2023 in the United States and in other places. Because what gender means and whether or how it matters depends on who you are, where you live,
Right.
and the time period. And I find that fascinating,
Mm-hmm.
intellectually, but I also wanted to say that pragmatically and personally, that we want to make sure that everyone gets to be and become who they ought to be.
There's so much in what you just said there. And I kind of want to start with the language because you yourself just use some terminology that in my own history with this issue is terminology that we didn't use 20 years ago when we were talking about some of these issues. So let's break down some of the terminology that the listeners might be encountering. So for example, if they understand that a kid in their life is transgender, what does that mean?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked. Language is so important to us. It helps
Yeah.
constitute our reality and what we say. The message that we're intending to send sometimes is not always the message that is received by people who are
Right.
listening to us. So, on the one hand, it's really, really important to know that language and terminology changes all the time. And the
Right.
easiest thing to do is just to ask someone what language they use
Mm.
to describe themselves or how they'd like to be described by somebody else. It's the most polite, it's the easiest thing to do, is
Right.
just ask. So, We have a large number of words and terms that we can use to
Mm-hmm.
describe gender, and one of them is transgender. And
Mm-hmm.
transgender typically means, it's kind of an umbrella term, to mean people whose gender identity does not align with, doesn't match, if you will, the sex that was
Right.
assigned at birth. Right? So each of us in this country has a birth certificate, and there typically is a category, a little line that says sex,
Mm-hmm.
and it will typically say M for male or F for female. Um, and so people who describe themselves as trans, people who are transgender, um, would have a gender identity today as a child or as an adult that does not conform or match or align with the sex that was assigned at birth. So a young person who was assigned male at birth
Mm-hmm.
might identify as a girl or a woman. That's who they are.
Right. And the next term that I'm going to ask you about is actually, well, the next two terms are the ones that have me most excited, I think is the actual right word to use, because I think that in some ways, to my thinking at least, there's some of the more evolved ways of thinking about these issues. And so let me ask you about non-binary and non-conforming. We can talk about both of those together.
Sure. Let's take a step back though and think about how transgender is a word that we've developed in order to describe people who are not cisgender. So it's important to
Right.
talk about the unmarked category as well as the marked category. So if we presume everyone's cisgender unless you tell us otherwise, let's talk about what that unmarked category is. Cisgender, as I mentioned about myself, is a person whose gender identity is aligned, does match
Mm-hmm.
up with, does conform to the sex that was assigned at birth. And most of us walking around who are cisgender don't give a lot of thought to that. So
Right.
we've had to develop a term to denote, to refer to people who don't have that kind of life experience, meaning transgender.
Right.
So that raises the question of a term called gender binary.
Right.
And again, not a new term, but one that is becoming more common in use. And so if we think about non binary, let's talk about binary first.
Mm-hmm.
Binary means it's kind of based on the assumption that there is only two ways to identify gender, that they are mutually exclusive, that they are easily recognizable, and that there's kind of a rigid distinction between the two of
Yeah.
them. That's kind of a gender binary. We often think in binaries, black and white, up and down, open, closed. You know, it's kind of easy and simple to think about, to think through binaries. And I would challenge us to remember that not everything is black and white.
Right.
Things are in positions that are not just up or down or open, closed. So gender is a binary in that same kind of way that there is a spectrum, that there's um, a continuum
Mm-hmm.
across those poles, and that people who are non-binary do not identify with the um, ends of those
Right.
of that pole. So someone who is gender non-binary, or any other word that they choose to use for themselves to describe themselves, is someone who does not identify with, comport with, does not understand themselves, does not identify as either male or female.
Right. Right. And again, that's what I think is kind of exciting about this, because all the young people that I talk to that are experiencing that, using these terms, have an experience that's actually very similar to you described as your own experience, where they don't fit in a box. And what I find exciting about this term, and that more and more people are comfortable using it, is I think that they feel comfortable saying, and I'm not going to pick either box. I don't feel comfortable in either. And so I'm not going to pick either. And I think that's, again, I find it exciting. I think it reflects a tremendous amount of bravery. And I'm glad that we're seeing it used more and more, to be frank. And how does that differ, though, than from non conforming?
Yeah, and this will vary based on a person's own understanding of what those terms mean.
Right,
So, gender nonconforming could be someone who does not comport or align with
right,
society's expectations for the gender binary. It could be how they express themselves, right? You could be gender nonconforming in how you dress or how you move through the world with your body. It could be the kinds of activities that you engage in. Gender nonconforming typically, but not always, refers to gender expression, right?
Hmm.
How we communicate about ourselves to people in the world. That said, I want to clarify that gender identity is typically thought of as something between your ears, right?
Hmm.
It's how you identify, it's internal. You know yourself. Gender expression is how we push out, how we communicate our gender to other people. So it's important to know that you don't always know someone's gender identity just because of how they happen to be expressing themselves in front of you at that moment.
And I should mention that this next term is one that I'm not as comfortable with in terms of knowing exactly what is meant when people say variant, because again, I've seen it used in a lot of different ways that seems very consistent with the other terminology that we just described. And in your professional experience, how is variant used?
We see the term gender variance or gender variant used in all different kinds of places. They typically, I mean, I've seen it as a more technical term
Hmm.
in a way, trying to be more inclusive of. We also see the term gender diverse,
Hmm.
uh, and and I would say the beauty of language is that we have lots of opportunities to select what matches and makes sense for us. And I use this comparison for anyone who's ever been to Home Depot or Lowe's or has ever tried to renovate their house or been able to paint a wall in their dorm. You know that you select a color. And when you go to all those paint chip colors, you remember the nuance,
Yeah.
the variation. Oh my gosh, it's seafoam green. It's not sage green, right? So we embrace that multiplicity of description when it comes to our paint chip colors. And I can tell you that the color in my living room is heather mist. It's been that way for 20 years, but I still remember that color
Right.
name because it matters to me. I selected it myself. It expresses my own sensibility. So if we're able to embrace that kind of nuance and multiplicity with our paint chip colors, I think we can figure it out for how we identify in terms of our gender.
Which is an interesting segue to a term that I want to go back to, even though you already defined it, which is cisgender. Because I have to admit, and it's actually it's a very, I think, privileged insight. The first time that I was referred to as cisgendered, it didn't feel great. It's like, wow, that I feel like I've just been put in a box, like you said earlier, and
Mhm.
I don't know if I like everybody else that's in this box. I don't know what this box means, right? So so first of all, is cisgender pejorative, or is it just a way to actually take the onus out of forcing only one group of people to identify and making us all identify?
I appreciate the question, and it brings my attention to this notion of marked and unmarked categories,
Yeah,
right? And who is presumed to be universal
right.
and normal, and who is presumed to be other or not belonging or different with a
Mm.
capital D in a kind of pejorative way. So I find it helpful to name the presumptive universal because it helps us acknowledge that those of us who have affiliations in those so-called universal
Hmm.
categories are not always even the numerical majority,
Right.
let alone the culturally dominant group. But because of differences in power and equity in our society, people who are in those unmarked categories tend to have access to more resources and power
Yeah.
in our community. So yeah, it might feel a little like, you're
Right.
putting some constraints on me by naming who I am. I could walk around in
Right.
the world 5 years ago without having to think about that. Well, people who are trans typically have to think about their gender identity and how they're going to be um, accepted or embraced by others all the time. So it behooves us. It's on us who are part of those unmarked categories, whether it's race,
Hmm.
religion, gender, um, ability, to take hold of those unmarked categories.
Yeah.
We have to name them.
And that feeling that you just described of walking around wondering how you have to identify, how you're going to be accepted. That brings me into my next question. And this is the Talking About Kids podcast. My listeners care a lot about kids. Why is it important that we pay attention to these gender identity and gender expression issues with respect to the kids in our lives?
There's two ways of answering this question. One is what happens if we do love the children that we have, and the other is what happens if we
Mm,
don't. Let me respond to the negative
okay.
first. What happens if we don't love the children that we have, the children that we have in our family, the children that we have in our schools, in our community, at our workplace, etc.? If we don't love them, if we don't accept who they are on their own terms, then we are perpetuating significant, significant amount of pain and harm. And I want to use some extreme examples to prove the
Mm,
point. This is not to say that all people who are trans are experiencing these consistently and all the time everywhere. I think that paints a terribly inaccurate picture, and I always want to think about the strength and contribution and dignity that trans people
mhm,
have. But if we don't love the children in our lives, if we don't love the kids in our lives, we are contributing to their absence,
mm,
their psychological and emotional absence in our lives. They're not able to be who they are with us. So we lose out. Let's put it on us who need to learn more about trans people and non-binary people. We lose out
mhm,
on getting to know our children in their full selves. So that's kind of an emotional, right, absence. We also are contributing to incredibly damaging forms of social exclusion and physical harm. So, the lack of understanding, the lack of acceptance, the lack of protection, the lack of embrace of trans and non binary young people in our lives means that they are encountering a lack of
mhm.
safety, a lack of security, physical harm and damage on an everyday, every week, every month basis, whether it's at home, in school, at work, in the community. We can look at a large number of surveys and interview data that tell us that harassment and assault against people who are gender
Right.
nonconforming, trans, non binary is high,
Yep.
unacceptable. We also know that the kinds of hostile conditions that trans people exist in
Mhm.
every day means that they're not able to typically, when I say typically, I mean on average, in the other sense that lots of people are successful and get through these institutions that are so
Right.
harmful institutions. But too many young people are being discouraged from staying in school, or too many young people are discouraged and pushed out of their
Yep.
families. Too many young people who are trans and non-binary are part of the unhoused and housing unstable population in our community. Just for example, too many trans and non-binary young people are found in the
Mhm.
system, whether it's the foster care system or the juvenile justice system. So systems involved young people um, have a disproportionate representation of trans non-binary people, young people. And I want to emphasize here the importance to pay attention to who among trans and
Mhm.
non-binary young people are being caught up in these systems and pushed out of schools and families. And they are our young brown and black trans and
Yep.
non-binary young people. So BIPOC, black, indigenous, people of color, youth are overrepresented in all of those kinds of ways that you don't want your own children to be,
Right.
right? They are being caught up in foster care and I'm not, I shouldn't say foster care, I should say the welfare
Right.
system and the juvenile justice system. And sometimes it's a revolving door, as social scientists have called it, a revolving door between the welfare system and the juvenile justice system. So that's what happens when we don't love
Right.
our children. Is we decide who's deserving of our love and acceptance and embrace and access to resources, and those who are not. And unfortunately, trans, non-binary, particularly young people of color, have are deemed by various
Yep.
institutions and their own families not to belong, not to be deserving of their love. So when we do love them, what happens?
Mm.
Young people can thrive. They can um, be who they
Right.
ought to be, and um, and I want to say this uh, in a way that I hope it comes across well. Not everything is about gender. And so, if people could just be who they are in terms of their gender identity and gender expression, then they can grow up to be an astronaut, or they can decide they want to go to law
Right.
school. They can be a wonderful athlete. They can learn that they love to read books.
Yeah.
That's what can happen. That's what can happen when we love our children. We can diminish the extraordinarily high rate of suicidality and suicide attempts and very unfortunate suicide completions among our young people. That's what can happen when you love your children.
You know, hearing you talk, I have to keep coming back to James Baldwin, who when he describes the cost of racism, of separation, of othering, because he talked about that quite a bit. He said the cost is something better. What did we miss out by not having them at the table, by not having them in the community, by not having their input, their creativity, their ideas? We miss out on something better. It's this is a bit of a loaded question because I think it could go in a bunch of different directions. But what are some of the myths that you encounter about you know gender identity and gender expression and kids?
So I think there are lots and lots of myths. I think I'd like to I'll identify one myth, which is that trans people are
Mm,
a new phenomenon. Trans people have existed throughout time and
yeah.
space. The categories we might use, the language we might have, the roles that they play in the world have varied greatly, but people who don't adhere to society's understandings of gender categories, whatever they
Right.
are, um, um, uh, have been around forever. And also that in lots of societies, there are more than just two gender
Yeah.
categories. So there are plenty of places and times where we find people who are not part of a gender binary. They are part of another gender category that is recognized, that is embraced, that is seen as
Mm-hmm.
normal, quote unquote, in a particular time or place. So um, and as we discussed, gender nonconforming people
Mm-hmm.
for sure have always been expressing gender that is not necessarily in alignment with societal
Right.
expectations for what it ought to be or supposed to be. Cultural change is an exciting
Exciting.
thing to think about.
Exciting. Yeah.
It really is. I know that some people feel threatened, that they
Yeah.
might fear moving away from what has been a quite rigid system, at least in their own experience or worldview. And and when I do work with educators and they express a concern about a child who might be communicating a gender that is not on one pole or
Mm-hmm.
side of the binary, I say, so what are you really concerned about?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm truly, again, with that kind of
Yeah.
deep empathy, like I really trying to understand what are you really concerned about? And I would repeat that,
Right.
I will, and I do repeat that question more than once, not in a hostile, accusatory, judgmental way, but in a really exploratory, curiosity-based way. I'm really, really interested in what are you really concerned about? Are you concerned about family rejection and that child not having a place to sleep
Mm-hmm.
tonight? Let's talk
Mm-hmm.
about that. Are you concerned about how others are going to respond in their class?
Let's talk
Let's
about
talk
that.
about the
Yeah.
policies and practices in the school then. Are you concerned about the limitations that might be placed upon them in terms of their
Mm.
professional career trajectories? Okay, well, let's talk about opening up and ensuring that everyone has access to develop into the professional that they wish to. Are you concerned about
Yeah.
what? right? So if people could just ask themselves that question, really listen and be still and be quiet for a moment, it might help them reveal what the anxiety or concern, fear is about. Is it about, wow, this person's really challenging my own ideas about what gender's supposed to be? Oh, I'm having trouble actually deciding and knowing what gender the person is
Right.
because their expression is different than what I'm accustomed to. That's
Yeah.
about me. That's not about the child, right? So maybe the simplest question is whatever myth there is that we're talking about, okay, what actually am I
Mm.
concerned about? And that I think will lead us to um, a
Hmm.
solution if there is actually a problem. Because I would say
Mm.
99% of the time, the problem is not the child standing
Right.
in front of you. It's the policy, it's the behavior around that child, it's your own inner
Mhm.
voice being challenged. Maybe it's a worldview. So if we think about discerning between the anti-trans and anti-non-binary and the rigid attention to gender binary as the
Yeah.
problem, the solution then is to kind of, open things up and allow the person to learn to read and
Yeah.
do math and participate in PE and graduate on time, right? That's the solution. What do we need to do to create the conditions in a school or in a family where a child can be loved for
Right.
who they are and accomplish the tasks at hand? We need to solve the problem of the anti trans bias, the policies and practices
Right.
that perpetuate anti-trans bias. We don't need to solve the
Right.
child, right? So distinguishing between the person and the problem is a huge step that people can make. And that's where I think you can get to after you ask yourself, what
Yeah.
am I really concerned about here?
And if my listeners want to learn more about these issues, and given that there is such a tremendous amount of misinformation out there, what are some sources that they can trust to get tips for, for loving the kids in their lives?
Sure. So if one of the things that we can ask each other to do is to love the children
Yeah.
in front of you, the other thing we can ask each other to do is
Yeah.
to do your homework. Just because you're not in school anymore doesn't mean you don't have homework. So let's do our homework and let's find the reliable sources. One of them is Gender Spectrum. Gender Spectrum has a wide variety of resources that are relevant for
Good.
inclusive schools. And there's also some materials there that will help family life as well. You also can, of course, go to other organizations like
Mm-hmm.
GLSEN, GLSEN, sounds like
Hmm.
listen, but it's GLSEN. And that's a national education organization dedicated to creating LGBTQ inclusive K-12 schools in particular. And that gives me a nice reminder to say that we're talking about creating families, schools, workplaces, communities that are trans and
Yeah.
non binary inclusive. That requires, it mandates that those spaces are also anti racist, disability accessible, and inclusive in all the walks of life that you can imagine that trans and non-binary people are from, because trans and non-binary people
Right.
come from all
Right.
walks of life. So if anyone listening might think, oh, well, this is a special situation and there's not that many trans and non-binary students in my school, there aren't any in my family that I know of today, my workplace doesn't really talk about it. Well,
They're
they are
there.
there, number
Right.
one.
Exactly.
They're there. As a cisgender person, I can't say we are everywhere, but LGBTQ
Yep.
people are everywhere. Trans and non-binary people are everywhere, and they come from all
Yep.
communities, which means that our families, schools, workplaces, and communities, and our legislation need to be not only trans and non-binary inclusive in that
Right.
one-dimensional kind of way, but they need to be that multiply dimensional kind of way. That's my public service announcement for um, what we now call and has been called for decades now intersectionality. Right, that Lots of people come from multiply marginalized places, and all of us have multiple identities,
Right.
some of which may be marginalized in society.
I've been in a lot of meetings with you over the years, a lot of conferences, a lot of rooms, and I want to thank you so much for your bravery. You never let people forget about this intersectionality, and I know that it isn't easy to always be standing up for these kids, and I just want you to know that I'm grateful that you're out there doing this work, and thank you so much for being on this podcast.
It is my pleasure, and I appreciate the role that you've played in our community as well. And I know that time is limited, but I do just want to say that people who want to love children also need to know what the
Yep.
policies are, and need to do their homework that way as well. Um, and to get the support that you need. And I want to mention two organizations
Please.
that are in Arizona at least, and that there are many others in other places. One is AZ Typo, Arizona Trans Youth and Parent Organization, and SAGA, Southern Arizona Gender Alliance. Those are two organizations that provide the support for the parents of trans and non-binary young people. So do your homework, get yourself figured out and supported so that you can love your children immediately today.
And those links will be on the website. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much.
That was Madelaine Adelman. For more information about Maddie, including links to resources on sexual orientation and gender identity and expression handpicked by her, please visit talkingaboutkids.com. From there, you also can find out about upcoming episodes, suggest a topic, learn more about me and my books, or submit your questions for future guests. Our theme song is by The Senators. For more of their music, go to thesenatorsmusic.com. And remember, kids are young goats and young children. And the difference is that young goats are easier to manage.